So Donald Trump just invoked emergency powers in a late-night executive order, and now senior Republicans are publicly breaking ranks to oppose him. And what triggered this constitutional crisis? His determination to bypass Congress entirely on a spending package they'd already rejected 3 times. According to sources inside the White House who spoke to Politico, Trump told his inner circle, "If they won't give me what I need, I'll take it myself." This isn't just another executive overreach or political power play. We're talking about a sitting president declaring emergency powers to circumvent the legislative branch's constitutional authority over spending. And trust me, when you've got lifelong Republican senators calling this unconstitutional and Republican House members threatening investigations, you know something massive just happened. It's honestly hard to believe we're watching a president claim emergency authority while his own party leaders are publicly calling it an abuse of power. Let me fill you in on what's been happening. Trump's relationship with congressional Republicans has been deteriorating for months over his domestic spending priorities. He's been demanding massive increases for border infrastructure, significant cuts to federal agencies he considers part of the deep state, and redirected funds for what he calls national security priorities. But House Republicans, even those generally loyal to Trump, balked at the specific package. According to CNN's December 18th report, the spending bill failed 3 separate votes in the House, with more Republicans defecting each time. Even Freedom Caucus members who typically support Trump's most aggressive moves voted against it, citing concerns about constitutional process and fiscal responsibility. But here's where the rubber meets the road. Rather than negotiating with Congress or accepting the legislative defeat, Trump decided to simply declare a national emergency. According to the executive order released at 11:47 p.m. on December 19th, Trump claims that congressional inaction on critical national security spending constitutes an emergency that threatens the security of the United States. The order invokes the National Emergencies Act and claims authority to reallocate already appropriated funds from other programs to his priorities. And before we go any further, let's be real for a second. Presidents declaring emergencies to get around Congress isn't new. But doing it when your own party controls Congress and still won't give you what you want, that's a level of constitutional hardball that crosses lines even Trump's previous actions hadn't touched. Here's where it gets interesting. According to multiple sources, including CBS, Politico, and The Washington Post, here's what went down in the hours after Trump signed that executive order. The White House released the order with no advance warning to congressional leadership. Republican senators found out the same way the public did, by seeing it reported on cable news just before midnight. According to a senior Republican aide who spoke to Politico on condition of anonymity, several committee chairs immediately began calling each other trying to figure out what had just happened and what their response should be. The bombshell came when Senator Mitt Romney, speaking to reporters outside his office at 7:00 a.m. the next morning, didn't mince words. He called the emergency declaration constitutionally indefensible and announced he would be introducing a resolution to terminate the emergency under the Congressional Review Act. But Romney wasn't alone. By mid-morning, according to CNN's count, at least 12 Republican senators had expressed concerns ranging from constitutional questions to outright opposition. Senate Majority Leader John Thune, usually careful to avoid direct confrontation with Trump, issued a statement saying the Senate would carefully review whether this emergency declaration meets legal standards and that Congress's power of the purse is fundamental to constitutional government. The immediate reaction sent shockwaves through Republican circles because this wasn't the usual Trump pushes boundaries and Republicans quietly grumble but fall in line pattern. This was open revolt from members of his own party while Democrats watched in somewhat stunned silence. According to reporters in the Capitol, Republican offices were fielding angry calls from both sides. Constituents furious that Congress was opposing Trump, and constituents furious that Trump was bypassing Congress. The party was fracturing in real time over a fundamental question: does presidential power have any limits when the president claims emergency authority? Now, this isn't the first time we've seen Trump use emergency powers to bypass Congress, and it's not the first time Republicans have faced the loyalty versus principle dilemma. Just think about how Trump declared a national emergency in 2019 to fund border wall construction after Congress refused to appropriate the money he demanded. He invoked emergency powers to redirect military construction funds. Republicans were uncomfortable, but most fell in line. A few senators, including Romney, voted with Democrats to terminate the emergency, but it wasn't enough to override Trump's veto. The wall got built, the precedent was set, and Trump learned that emergency declarations could work as end runs around Congress. Then there was his use of emergency authority during COVID-19, when Trump claimed sweeping powers to redirect agency actions, bypass normal procurement processes, and assert federal authority over state decisions. Some of these moves were legally justified given the pandemic, but others pushed boundaries in ways that concerned even Republican governors who found their authority superseded by federal emergency declarations. Again, most Republicans stayed quiet, not wanting to appear to undermine Trump during a crisis. And let's not forget how Trump used executive authority to implement policies Congress had explicitly rejected, from Remain in Mexico asylum policies to Schedule F reclassification of federal employees. In each case, when Congress wouldn't give him what he wanted legislatively, Trump found executive or emergency powers to claim authority anyway. Each time, Republican objections were muted. Each time, the principle of congressional authority eroded a little more. Each time, Trump learned that if he pushed hard enough and claimed the stakes were high enough, his party would ultimately acquiesce. Now it looks like this emergency declaration might finally be the step too far, the moment where enough Republicans decide that defending constitutional structure matters more than party loyalty. The pattern has been building toward this confrontation for years. Trump pushes executive authority. Republicans express concerns but ultimately defer. Trump pushes further. The question is whether this time will actually be different, or whether this too will follow the established pattern of initial resistance followed by eventual capitulation. So what specifically did Trump claim in this emergency declaration that caused even loyal Republicans to balk? Let's break it down. The executive order asserts that congressional failure to appropriate funds for critical national security infrastructure constitutes a national emergency. It claims authority under the National Emergencies Act to reallocate up to $47 billion in previously appropriated funds from various federal programs to Trump's priorities. According to legal experts who reviewed the order, the specific claim is that national security threats are so immediate and severe that waiting for normal congressional appropriations would create unacceptable risks to the United States. Now here's the kicker. The funds Trump wants to reallocate include money from disaster relief programs, veterans' health care, infrastructure projects already underway, and education grants. According to an analysis by the Congressional Research Service reported by Politico, the reallocation would effectively defund programs that Congress specifically chose to fund while funding programs Congress specifically chose not to fund. That's not emergency authority addressing an unforeseen crisis. That's using emergency declaration to override congressional appropriations decisions. That fundamentally inverts the Constitution's separation of powers. The legal dimension gets even more problematic. Jonathan Turley, the George Washington University constitutional law professor who has often defended Trump's legal positions, told Fox News that this emergency declaration is legally dubious at best. He explained that emergency powers are meant for genuine emergencies, unforeseen circumstances where normal legislative process is too slow. Using them to override Congress when Congress has repeatedly considered and rejected your funding request isn't an emergency, it's a policy dispute. And you can't declare emergencies just because you lost a legislative battle. This leaves Republicans in an extraordinarily difficult position. On one side, they need to maintain their relationship with Trump and his base. Republican primary voters overwhelmingly support Trump. Opposing him on anything invites primary challenges from MAGA candidates. The Republican coalition depends on keeping Trump supporters engaged and voting. Crossing Trump means risking your political career in many red districts and states. That's not a small consideration for members whose political survival depends on staying in Trump's good graces. On the flip side, they have to defend the institutional prerogatives of Congress itself. If the president can declare emergencies to override congressional spending decisions, then what's the point of Congress? The Constitution explicitly gives the power of the purse to the legislature, not the executive. Allowing this emergency declaration to stand would permanently weaken congressional authority. Future presidents of either party could use this precedent to bypass Congress whenever they lost a legislative fight. That's not a power Republicans will want a Democratic president to have. The tricky part is, there's no middle ground that satisfies both imperatives. You either defend congressional authority and oppose the emergency declaration, or you defer to Trump and accept the erosion of legislative power. Several Republican senators are trying to thread the needle by saying they want more information. They're studying the legal questions. They hope to work with the administration to find a path forward. But ultimately, when the resolution to terminate the emergency comes to a vote, they'll have to choose. Legal and constitutional experts are noting that this emergency declaration tests fundamental principles of American government. Andrew McCarthy, the former federal prosecutor and conservative legal analyst, wrote in National Review that while he generally supports Trump's policy goals, this use of emergency authority is constitutionally indefensible. He argued that the founders created separation of powers specifically to prevent exactly this kind of executive overreach. If Congress won't fund something, the president doesn't get to fund it anyway by declaring an emergency. That's not how constitutional government works. Lawrence Tribe, the Harvard constitutional law professor who generally opposes Trump, actually found himself agreeing with McCarthy on the legal analysis. He told MSNBC that this represents one of the clearest cases of unconstitutional executive overreach in modern American history. When legal experts from opposite ends of the political spectrum agree that something violates constitutional principles, that's significant. It means this isn't a question where reasonable people can disagree based on political preferences. The legal answer is clear even if the political calculations are complicated. Even some conservative legal voices who've consistently defended Trump's other controversial actions are drawing a line here. Josh Blackman, the South Texas College of Law professor who supported Trump's travel ban and other executive actions, told Fox News that this emergency declaration lacks the legal foundation that made those other actions defensible. He explained that there's a difference between aggressive use of legitimate executive authority and claiming authority that simply doesn't exist. This falls into the latter category. So, let's break down what this could mean because it's not just a dramatic constitutional clash. It has serious consequences for American governance, Republican Party unity, and the future of executive power. First up, the immediate impact on the federal budget. If this emergency declaration stands, $47 billion gets reallocated from programs Congress chose to fund to programs Congress chose not to fund. Disaster relief money already allocated to communities recovering from hurricanes and wildfires gets redirected. Veterans waiting for healthcare facility improvements see those projects delayed or canceled. Infrastructure projects creating jobs in Republican districts get defunded. The disruption ripples through federal agencies and the communities that depend on these programs. That creates real political pain for Republicans who'll have to explain to constituents why their local priorities got sacrificed for Trump's emergency declaration. But beyond the immediate budget impact, there's the institutional damage to congressional authority. Legal scholars across the political spectrum note that if this precedent stands, it fundamentally alters the balance of power between branches. Future presidents will cite Trump's emergency declaration as justification for their own end runs around Congress. A Democratic president could declare climate change a national emergency and reallocate defense spending to green energy. A Republican president could declare border security emergencies to redirect education funding. Once the precedent exists that losing a legislative fight justifies declaring an emergency, there's no limiting principle. Congress becomes advisory rather than authoritative on spending. Looking ahead to broader political implications, this creates a defining moment for the Republican Party. Do they stand for constitutional principles and limited executive power, or do they defer to Trump regardless of constitutional concerns? According to Politico's reporting, Republican strategists are deeply worried about the optics either way. If they oppose Trump, they look weak and divided heading into the next election cycle. MAGA primary challengers will attack them as Rhinos who betrayed the president. But if they support this emergency declaration, Democrats will hammer them as hypocrites who abandoned their constitutional principles for political expediency. Moderate voters who value institutional stability will see Republicans as enablers of executive overreach. There's no good political outcome. The institutional implications might be the most concerning long-term consequence. For 250 years, American democracy has relied on the separation of powers to prevent tyranny. The founders explicitly gave Congress the power of the purse because they understood that controlling spending is the ultimate check on executive authority. No matter how powerful a president becomes, if Congress controls the money, the president can't act without legislative consent. But if presidents can simply declare emergencies to bypass congressional spending decisions, that fundamental check disappears. the executive becomes effectively unbound on the single most important power Congress possesses. This whole scenario is causing genuine panic among constitutional conservatives who've spent decades arguing for limited government and separation of powers. According to the National Review, their writers are torn between their general support for Trump's policy goals and their recognition that this emergency declaration violates the constitutional principles they've spent their careers defending. The Federalist Society, the conservative legal organization that's been instrumental in Trump's judicial appointments, is conspicuously silent. Members are reportedly divided, uncomfortable openly opposing Trump, but equally uncomfortable endorsing this use of emergency authority. Meanwhile, Democrats are in the unusual position of defending congressional prerogatives that they'll want to assert when they control Congress again. According to reporting from the Hill, Democratic leadership is coordinating with the handful of Republicans willing to oppose the emergency declaration. They're planning a joint resolution to terminate the emergency under the Congressional Review Act. The political dynamics are bizarre, with some Republicans and Democrats finding themselves on the same side defending institutional principles, while the president and his loyalists claim everyone opposing him is part of the swamp trying to block needed reforms. Things became even more intense when Trump responded to Republican criticism with a series of posts on Truth Social. He called Republican senators who questioned his emergency declaration weak, pathetic, and tools of the deep state. He suggested that real Republicans support their president, and that anyone opposing this emergency declaration is effectively siding with Democrats against America's security. According to screenshots circulated on social media, Trump specifically called out several senators by name, questioning their loyalty and suggesting they should face primary challenges. This is the classic Trump playbook: respond to institutional or constitutional objections by making it personal, by framing any opposition as betrayal rather than legitimate constitutional concern. Legal analysts are noting that if this emergency declaration survives congressional and judicial review, it will represent a fundamental transformation of American government. The president would have demonstrated the ability to declare emergencies to override congressional spending decisions. That's a power no previous president has successfully claimed, and it's a power that radically expands executive authority. According to former White House counsel under both parties, this is the kind of precedent that, once established, is almost impossible to roll back. Future presidents won't voluntarily give up authority their predecessors claimed. The ratchet only turns one direction, toward more executive power and less congressional authority. So here's the deal. Donald Trump declared a national emergency to redirect $47 billion in spending that Congress repeatedly refused to appropriate, and now members of his own party are openly calling it unconstitutional and threatening to terminate the emergency. This isn't just about one spending fight or one emergency declaration. It's about whether the Constitution's separation of powers still functions, or whether presidents can now claim emergency authority whenever they lose a legislative battle. When your own party's senators are introducing resolutions to terminate your emergency declaration and conservative constitutional lawyers are calling your actions indefensible, we've entered genuinely unprecedented territory. If this emergency stands, then we're basically saying presidents can declare emergencies to override Congress anytime they find legislative process inconvenient. That would mean the power of the purse, the most fundamental congressional authority, becomes meaningless when faced with a president willing to claim emergency powers. This isn't just about Trump or Republicans. It's about whether separation of powers constrains executive authority, or whether it's become a suggestion that presidents can ignore when politically convenient. The next few weeks are critical. Congress will vote on terminating the emergency. Courts will review the constitutional questions, and Republicans will decide whether constitutional principles or party loyalty matters more when they're in direct conflict. So keep an eye on this. The congressional vote is expected within 10 days. Multiple lawsuits have already been filed challenging the emergency declaration, and Trump's rhetoric toward Republican dissenters is escalating daily. The stakes have never been higher, the constitutional principles never more directly tested, and the outcome never more uncertain for the future of American democracy.